Well, hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Third Place Books. From wherever you are this evening, one of the cool things about this virtual series of author events that we've been doing, as I was just saying with our authors before we went live, is that you can join a Third Place Books event from anywhere in the country, sometimes anywhere in the world. So we are so lucky to be able to welcome people from all around the country tonight. And wherever you are tonight, welcome, one and all. My name is Sam. Many of you who are based here in the Seattle area may recognize me from our three bookstores here, Lake Forest Park, Ravenna, and Seward Park. And if you don't know me, if you're coming to Third Place Books for the first time, we are so glad to have you. I have just a couple of announcements to make before we get to tonight's program, which is one that we have been looking forward to for quite a while and are very, very excited about. But if I can have a moment of your time, we are here tonight to, of course, celebrate books, as we are every night, every time we come on and do these author events on Zoom. Tonight, we are celebrating this wonderful book, just out in hardcover, just late last month, and a very different and exciting kind of book from a beloved author, Deborah Tannen. The book is Finding My Father. It is a memoir. Some of you, I think, out there in the audience may have already picked up copies of it. I know we've been selling copies of it left and right, so I think some of you may have bought it from us, and we thank you for that. If you have not picked up a copy of Finding My Father and you would like to tonight, I'm going to drop a link in the chat in just a moment to purchase that book from Third Place Books. We have more copies coming in as we speak, and we are happy to ship that book to you anywhere in the country via USPS Media Mail. We are also happy to have that book on hold for you at any one of our three locations if you're local to the Seattle area. And no matter what, we so appreciate your support. We also have copies of Joan Silber's books. Here's Improvement, the much lauded novel from a couple of years ago. Please, I will drop links in the chat to some of these, and again, I encourage you to pick some of these books up. Your book purchase is what keeps Third Place Books working. It's what allows us to keep doing what we do in this strangest of years, and it is what allows authors like Deborah Tannen and Joan Silber to keep writing and keep working and keep chronicling our times and our history and fitting those two together in such important ways. And so please don't be shy, pick up a copy of Finding My Father. Again, we'll make sure to get that book to you wherever you are. Now, tonight, if you have a question for our authors, you can pop it into the Q&A module. It's at the bottom of your screen in the toolbar there. It says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type a question in there, and we'll get to as many as we have time for at the end of the evening. Now, we are doing a lot of author events here at Third Place Books online right now. We're doing 2 or 3 of these a week, sometimes more. If there's, if you're enjoying what you see tonight and you think I'd like to attend more of these, then I encourage you to check us out on our website, thirdplacebooks.com. Check out our events calendar, see what else we've got going on there. You can sign up for our newsletter. We're sending 1 email a week with new author events right now. And you can also follow us on social media at Third Place Books on most of the major platforms out there. You'll get up-to-the-minute updates about what's going on in our stores and on our author events channels. Sure to be something else that you will enjoy. So we hope that we'll see you back here at some point soon. And now, without further ado, I am thrilled to welcome 2 authors who I'm told many out in the audience know and have a long connection to, sometimes familial, sometimes friendly. And many of you out there also have a long connection to both of these authors as readers, going back many, many years. And these are both authors whose books in my career I have sold hand over fist. So I'm so delighted to be sharing a screen with the 2 of you. This is such an honor. Deborah Tannen is the acclaimed author, of course, of You Just Don't Understand, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 years. And of course, she's also the author of the New York Times bestsellers You're Wearing That, about mothers and daughters, and You Were Always Mom's Favorite, about sisters, as well as many other books. A professor of linguistics at Georgetown University, she appears frequently on national television and radio and has been interviewed by 2020, The Oprah Winfrey Show, NBC's Today, NPR's Fresh Air, the New York Times Magazine, USA Today, Newsweek, Time, and the Harvard Business Review, among many, many others. She joins us tonight from the Washington, D.C. area. where she lives with her husband. Her new memoir, again, is Finding My Father. And joining Deborah Tannen is Joan Silber. She's the author of 8 works of fiction. The most recent, Improvement, a favorite of ours here at Third Place Books, won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award. Her previous book, Fools, was longlisted for the National Book Award and was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. The Size of the World was a finalist for the LA Times Fiction Prize, and Ideas of Heaven was a finalist for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. She's also the author of The Art of Time in Fiction. Her new novel, The Secrets of Happiness, plural, will be published in May 2021, and we are very excited about that. She lives in New York. She taught for many years at Sarah Lawrence College, and she now teaches in the Warren Wilson MFA program. Please, from wherever you're joining us tonight, put your hands together virtually for Deborah Tannen and Joan Silber. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It's a great pleasure for us to be here. It's an especial pleasure. I have to tell you as a kind of side comment that Deborah and I first met when we were 15 years old at Camp Gulliver. I was coming from New Jersey, she was from Brooklyn, but we were together at this camp. We both wanted to be writers, so it's very thrilling that we get to do this now. And we think that some of our old camp friends are in the audience tonight. Deb, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, it's so exciting. We have 3 of our friends from Camp Gulliver, Ellen Beagle, Carl Goldstein, and this name is going to mean something to you guys, Harriet Lerner. Amazing, yet another amazing writer, author of Dance of Anger and so many other books, also a friend from that same summer. I don't know what was in the water there at Camp Gulliver, but I'm honored to be here tonight with all of you, and especially with you, Joan. Thank you for doing this conversation. Oh, and you're my father, which is totally unique of all the people I've talked to.
Because Deb and I became friends even more after camp was over, and I visited her in Brooklyn and met both her parents, any number of times. So this whole thing is very gratifying for me. So I'm going to just start with the questions and go on, as at much length as you want to. The questions are sort of set up that way. So my first one is, my first question is actually to ask you to read a little bit. Can you just read a short section?
Okay, sure. What I will read is the beginning, and just short, like a minute and a half or something. This is how the book starts. I adored my father. He's the parent I felt an affinity with, the one I thought understood me. I traced to him my love of words, of language, of reading, and of writing. When my father was home, he was often sitting at his desk, writing. That remained his favorite place to be, his favorite thing to do, until he died 2 weeks before his 98th birthday. I don't know if I was emulating him or expressing the genes he passed on, but when I was a child, the object I loved most was an old black manual typewriter with yellowing keys rimmed in tarnished silver. I typed poems and stories and letters to my father, telling him what happened to me during the day, often laying out grievances against my mother. I talked to my father through letters because when I was growing up, he was rarely home. The strongest presence I felt in the house was his absence. A sense of yearning for him stayed with me long after I was grown. So that's how it starts.
I love that, Anthony. So my first question is, I know that your father asked you to write the book, and that was one of the reasons that you wrote it, although I think not the only one. So why do you think he wanted such a thing? And what do you think he had in mind? How do you think he imagined it?
It started with the idea that I would write a book based on his memories of Warsaw, Poland, where he grew up. So my father was born in 1908 in Warsaw in a Hasidic household. So very much a part of that Hasidic community. pre-World War I Warsaw, and then he was 6 when World War I broke out. He had astonishingly detailed memories of that community, of all the people he knew there. It could have been an entire book. He, as I said, he loved to write. He also wrote out a lot of his memories. So it started with that. My father also saved, I think, every piece of paper that came into his life. He saved, I'm pretty sure, every letter he received, copies of many of letters he wrote. He gave me journals that he had kept before he married. And once he knew I was going to write about his life, he was constantly writing out memories and sending them. And I found a letter that he wrote to someone, back in 81 or something. Deborah is going to write a book about the Jews of Poland based on my memories. So that's how it started. And I did initially think that's what it would be. And in fact, I wrote I went back to Poland with my father, 92 or something like that, and wrote a play at that time. And it was his memories of his childhood in Poland and my memories of my childhood with him interspersed. And that was kind of my model for what the book was going to be. And I should say just a quick note here. My father, he was witty and sharp. And when he first read my play, he said, "Oh, I get it. I didn't have a father and I didn't miss him, and you had a father and you missed him." And it's true, his father had died when he never knew his father. His father died of tuberculosis when he was very young. So that's how it started. But then as I spent so many hours with him, which I did spend many hours talking to him, talking about his past, his writing about his past, telling me about his past, I realized that his life spanned that whole 20th century and reflected, and he was affected by so many of the cataclysmic events of that century. So World War I in Europe, he came to this country in 1920, which was the absolute tail end of that massive migration of East European Jews to the United States. And he quit high school at 14 and went to work in New York's garment district, which was very classic for immigrants at the time. And yet he managed to become a lawyer. But he also, when he finished law school, passed the bar all at night, it was the Depression. And so that was a huge factor in his life. He was a communist, and I have his FBI file. So there were just many things in his life that reflected the era that I came to think was really interesting. And then there was just that, my attachment to him, and how, as I got to know more about his life, I just wanted to put more of it in the book, and really started to deal with my own, I resisted that. I didn't think of it as a memoir. I actually resisted the publisher calling it a memoir. No, I said, it's a biography of my father. But then they pointed out to me it had really become a memoir. It really ended up being a lot about me as well as about him.
One of the things I loved about the book is the way it begins. Really, the early sections are very much about your relationship to him and why and how you were really close. And for me, it was the foundation of the book. It's the real reason for its writing is the depth of feeling between the two of you. It made a big difference to have it start with that. I thought that was like a brilliant way to organize it. Thinking like a writer about how things are organized.
Thank you. Yeah, I started, I figured, well, people had to know why I cared about him. So that beginning is starting from when I was little and my view of him as a kid, and then throughout, going, and then ending with when he was quite old, again, 90s. My mother died when he was 95, she was 93, and he lived to be nearly 98. So I spent a lot of time with him, and then building up to those funny quips that he made about dying, and he talked so openly about dying, and he was funny. I mean, I'll just tell you one, when he was still sharp, but he forgot things. And so one time I showed up to meet him, and he was thrilled, but surprised. And I said, but Daddy, I talk to you every day, and I told you I'll be there in 5 days, I'll be there in 4 days, I'll be there in 3 days. And he said, no wonder I forgot, you keep changing it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's great. I love that. So the sort of crucial question in a lot of ways that I think other people have in mind is your previous books have involved interviewing people after beginning with a question or even a thesis that you want to, investigate. And this is very different. Can you talk about how it was different, kind of skills that you had already that applied to this, or that didn't apply to this, and the surprises of working on it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Originally, most of my books started not with interviewing at all, but analyzing recorded conversations. That was my method.
Oh, that's right. Of course. Yeah.
But so my first book, You Just Don't Understand. Yeah, I had a lot of anecdotes that people told me, but a lot of it was based on conversations I had transcribed and studied. But the more books I wrote for general audiences, the more I started actually interviewing people. So mothers and daughters, I talked to mothers about their daughters and daughters about their mothers, and sisters, same thing. I think I talked to 100 sisters about their relationship with their sisters. So I did start to do that. But it was very different with my father because I really wasn't, for the most part, looking for anything particular. But as he told me things that made things make sense that I had never really understood, then I would ask him questions, filling it in. But kind of interesting, I would ask him how he felt about things. And he would be more likely to tell me, describe from the outside. I'll give you, one of the most dramatic things I was asking him about. I knew, both my parents talked about the fact that there was another woman my father might have married. And it was not a secret. It was not at all sensitive. I call her Helen in the book. It's a pseudonym. But they refer to her as my mother's rival. And so one time I'm talking to my father and I'm asking him something about my mother, I guess, and I said something about his other girlfriend. And he said, your mother wasn't my girlfriend. Helen was my girlfriend. And then another time, I guess we were talking about Helen, and I said something like, were you dating mommy at this time too? And he said, I never dated your mother. Well, we spent I was with her a lot, and I guess I was sort of like a boyfriend, but maybe just the last year. What does that mean? Yeah. Yeah. And then at one point he had said that he had saved Helen's letters, but he didn't know what they were. And he said, if I could find them, I'd give them to you, but I don't know where they are anymore. So that really piqued my interest. And one time I was visiting, they were living in Westchester at this point in a condominium. And he said he was going to go down and find something in the storage room. And I offered to go with him. That was fine. We went down there. And after he found what he was looking for, I said, why don't we look for those letters? And he said, fine. So we started looking at all the boxes and bags. Now, he was very organized. So if it was my storage room, we'd be there a year. But he had labeled everything. So it didn't take all that long. But we looked at everything, that we didn't find it. And I was disappointed, but there was one carton left. It was on the highest shelf and way to the side. So I reached for it. And as I pulled it toward me, I heard a plop. And then I reach behind it and I pull out this manila envelope, kind of torn and dirty, and sure enough, it has her name on the outside. Mm-hmm. And I look inside and there all those letters in their envelopes and stamps and addressed to Eli Tannen, his name with her. And there are these sheets of paper. He had kept copies of many of his letters to her.
Oh.
So here was their correspondence, their relationship. So I clutched it to my chest. I was jumping up and down, and he was kind of looking at me with a smile, with a calm amusement. He was very calm. And he said, take them. So that was this drama. And I would ask him about that. A lot of my questions were about that. I when I read the letters, I really kind of fell in love with her myself. I thought she was wonderful. And it was clear they had had a romantic relationship. They had met at a dance and they had both been really infatuated. So I kept asking him, who would you have preferred to marry? If you just had to pick one, he would never say, he wouldn't say, oh, obviously your mother. And he wouldn't say, Helen. He kept saying, it doesn't matter who you marry. What matters is whether you're married or you're single. If you're married, you have to make a living. And this is very much the story of his life. Maybe we can talk about that a little later. All the jobs that he did. When he sat down to write his life, he started by listing all the jobs he had held. And the list came to 68.
Oh, what a resume.
68. Wow. And that was both something he was very proud of, that he did whatever he had to do to support his family. First his mother and sister, because he had no father, and then his wife and children. But it was also something he regretted. It was bad luck and bad decisions that he didn't just become a lawyer when he finished law school. So from his view, he said, if you're married, you have to, that's why he had to have all these 68 jobs. You have to make a living. If you're not married, you're free. You can do whatever you want. He said, so let's say I'm starving, I'll go to jail. What's the worst that can happen? It's warm, they give you food. Not so terrible. Well, he wasn't thinking about jail as it is now, but, and it's what he said. But yeah, so, and I thought he was just not wanting to tell me that he really would rather have married Helen. That's what I really thought. Yeah. And I never would say it. And I think actually it may not have been true. Well, for one thing, I think he and my mother ended up very much loving each other, and they were married 71 years, and they had a great life. I don't think he regretted it in that way. But I think it really made me see that my view of marriage and his view of marriage were totally different. To me, it's about a soulmate, your life companion who looks at the world the way you do. I don't think that was what it was. I don't think that's how he approached it. So many things about his life and mine, I realized, were so different. Maybe similar to this in a way. When we talked about decisions he had to make, he never asked what he wanted to do. He only ever asked what he had to do. And I always had the luxury, when I had to make a decision, of asking what I wanted to do.
Yes, I was going to ask about the difference between his generation and ours, and that's a really crucial one. As you were speaking, I wondered, would he not have been responsible for his mother and his sister had he not married?
So this is so fascinating. Another thing that came as a total surprise to me, that he had to quit high school at 14 to support his mother and sister because he had no father. That was a given. That was not anything he ever questioned. He had terrible regret about many decisions he made, one in particular, which we can talk about, a job that he left that he was really regretted. He never mentioned a sense of regret about quitting high school at 14 and going to work in a factory, and then becoming a lawyer was so difficult. 10-hour jobs, 10-hour work days in the factory, rush to law school, get home at 10:30, eat dinner, then study for several hours, sleep for a couple hours, and then do the same thing the next day. He never questioned that he had to do that. When I was reading these memories that he wrote for me, in one place he explained his mother was dead set against his quitting high school and going to work.
Oh.
She did everything she could to stop him. And it's especially fascinating because he never opposed his mother. He was very close friends with my mother's 3 brothers, and one of them told me he was terrified of his mother. He would never oppose her. If he wanted to do something that his mother was against, he would keep it a secret from her. And if she found out about it, then he wouldn't do it. Where did he get the strength to defy her in this way and quit high school? Of course he would be against it when I read about it. Of course, my grandmother, his mother, had founded and was principal of a school in Warsaw, the first school for Hasidic girls in Warsaw and probably in Poland. Of course, education was really important to her. And she was one of many, many brothers and sisters, another thing we could talk about. But because they were Hasidim, the brothers didn't have secular education, they just had religious education. But the sisters all had higher education. There was a dentist, a physicist, a linguist, they called her, who spoke many languages, so they were all very educated. And my father told me that she would talk with scorn of her brothers, analphabeta, illiterate, because they didn't speak Polish very well. So of course she would want him to continue his education. But he felt this obligation. It was his idea that because apparently she complained bitterly about how not knowing where they would find the rent money or the food money, but also that at her bitter fate, having been left with these two children to raise on her own because her husband died of tuberculosis. It was an arranged marriage, by the way, not anyone she chose for herself. They met at the wedding, which was typical. And so he felt it was his job to make it up to her. And that's why he felt he could never marry. So if we get to that story, that's the story there. He felt that he could never marry because he had to support his mother and sister. But if this time we'll tell it, if not, it's in the book, but why he eventually gave in and got married.
Can you just talk a little about his work life, and then I'm going to ask you more questions about the writing of it. What his work life really meant to him and how he felt at the end of it.
I'm sorry, how I felt or how he felt?
How he felt, actually.
How he felt?
You feel too. It's your book.
Originally I was going to write it while he was alive. And I had fantasies of going on the talk shows with him, where he would be the main one talking about Poland, because he was the one, it was his memories. And the reason I didn't, actually, originally, it was not my decision. In the mid-90s, it was after I had written You Just Didn't Understand, and then the one after it, Talking from 9 to 5. I proposed to the publisher that I wanted to write two books. One was a book that I did write called The Argument Culture, and it was about public discourse, the only book I've written about public discourse, and the book about my father. So I had the proposal, I had written the play, that's what I was going to do. And they didn't want the book about my father. They said, if you want us to publish The Argument Culture, you got to write a book about relationships. And I was young, and I thought, okay, I'll write it later. And I wrote a book called I Only Say This Because I Love You. So that's why I didn't write it. And then I wrote another one, and then I started to think maybe it would be better to write it after he was gone. And he said, if you write it while I'm alive, you'll have to be thinking of my feelings.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And I asked him about, what he would want in the book, and he said, if I'm gone, it's up to you. I know, I'll be gone. I have no opinion.
I have one writing question to ask, and then we can talk more about him, which is, no story of someone's life is easy to write because life is a mess, and you're trying to write something ordered when you write a book. And as a writing teacher, I have spent my life trying to get coherence out of what people are working on. So I know that you went through lots of moving around and revising in this. And one of my questions is, do you have any models? Were there any books that you sort of looked up to that were helpful, either directly connected or not connected at all?
So thank you for asking that. And you know how hard it was for me to write this. Yeah. I sometimes think it took me longer to write this book than all the others put together. As I tended to write it in the 90s, but I actually wrote a first draft around 2012 and quite a few drafts since. And then I wrote another book in between about women friends because I just couldn't figure out how to do this. So it was hard. And the major issue is what you're saying. I didn't know how to organize it. And I didn't have any models. The other kinds of books I know how to write. I read so many books by daughters about fathers. I probably read 25, 35, 45 books by daughters about fathers. And there was none that seemed anything like this. And so, no, none of them struck me as this is a model. One thing I knew I did not want to do is start at his birth. He was born and then go through his life. I knew that. Yeah, I knew that I had to go by themes. And I knew pretty early on that I needed to start with what I admired about him and what I loved him and the image of him from when I was a kid. But I really didn't know how to organize it. So I started by simply writing all the material that I had on all the subjects that interested me, which means I had much more than I could possibly deal with. And then I had to start asking, what would somebody else be interested in? You know, this is what I'm interested in, but what is a reader going to be interested in? So at one point, the chapter about his jobs, I didn't describe all 68, but he had written for every one of those jobs. After he listed them, he said about writing or dictating a description of every one. How did he get it? Where was it? Who were the other people? What did it involve? Stories, anecdotes, scenes. And so that, you know, material probably went to 100 pages on its own. And then I realized I had to shorten it to just the bits that would be of interest to a reader.
Now, to me, one of the most interesting jobs was when he was a prison guard, and the other when he was a cutter in the garment district, and of course the last as a lawyer. So maybe just say a few things about them so people can get a kind of grip on who he was through those.
Yes, those three are really, really the significant ones. So during the Depression, like so many other people, he was taking civil service tests. And he said he had taken so many, he lost count, and it might be 1,000 people taking an exam for a handful of jobs. So after the war had started, he got a notice that on the basis of a federal civil service exam, he was offered a job as a guard at the federal penitentiary in Danbury, Connecticut. Minimum security prison. I later learned, thanks to you, Joan, I did know that many conscientious objectors were sent to that prison, and you told me about a book that was memoirs of those, many of those prisoners, and I learned a lot more about the prison from them. That it was brand new, and that's why they were hiring all these guards.
It was a good prison. I mean, as prisons went.
As prisons went, yeah. So he took the job, and the family at that time, it was my mother, my father, my oldest sister, Naomi, was a little girl, and my mother's mother who lived with them. They moved to Danbury, Connecticut, and it turned out to be a very happy situation for them. Sure, it wasn't for all the prisoners, but partly because of the living situation. For the first time, they lived in a house with a yard, with a weeping willow tree in the backyard that both my father and Naomi always mentioned when they talked about living there. And they had a community. And this is something that I don't know I totally understood again until writing the book and really thinking about my father's life. I think there's a connection between that and how nostalgic he was for his childhood in Warsaw, in that Hasidic community where he lived in a big family. He lived in the household of his mother and her many, many brothers and sisters and her parents. And so they were part of a community there. Other New York Jews who had gotten the job the same way he had from the civil service exam. And so they had close friends that they really liked. And my father did well at the job. He was very quickly promoted to parole officer. Then he gets notice that on the basis of another civil service exam that he took, he's offered another job. And this is going to be as an alcohol tax inspector in Providence, Rhode Island. And when he describes that job, one of the sentences that stuck in my mind in describing that job, I gripped the gun I had hard and waited. What, my father gripping a gun? So it was chasing bootleggers.
Yeah.
So he was making $50 a week as a parole officer, and it was 6 days a week. And on Sunday, he was supplementing the income. It wasn't enough for them to live on. He drove a taxi. He was selling fur coats on consignment. He was going door to door, trying to get people to list their houses. He was always enterprising, trying to supplement the income. So this job was going to pay $12 a week more a month. Yeah, a week more. That's a lot. You know, for $50, a $12, it's like a 25% raise. And so he decided to take it. And like I said before, whether he liked the job and whether he would like the other one didn't enter into it. It was just, he had to support his family, and this was more money, and he had to do it. But when he went to tell the warden that he had been offered this job and he was going to take it, the warden was very upset and said, "Don't do it. You're doing so well here. You're going to be a warden." And he said, "No, that can't be. There are no Jewish wardens." And the warden said, "But that's because there were no Jews in the system. But now that there are, it's not an impediment. You're going to be a warden in a year." It turned out the warden knew that he himself was going to get promoted to be the head of the Bureau of Prisons, and that job was coming open, but he couldn't tell my father that, and my father didn't know that. He simply didn't believe him. He believed that the warden, he knew the warden liked him, he believed the warden would recommend him to be a warden, but he didn't believe that the higher-ups would ever approve it for a Jew. So he takes the other job. It doesn't work out. The job was fine, he did well at the job, but the family is very unhappy in Providence. They, again, they're living in an ugly apartment building. They don't make any friends. There are no other Jews. And then my mother gets pregnant with me. So I always felt guilty about this. My sister, so the prison, Danbury always was this like Garden of Eden. Everybody was happy. And my sister Mimi was born in Danbury. I thought that gave her like a fairy godmother. A twinkle, anointed her birth. And now I'm in Providence, where everybody was miserable. And then they go to, because of my mother got pregnant with me, they didn't want to have a baby in Providence, where she didn't know anybody and no relatives. She also was from a very big family. So they go back to New York. And my father is, again, without work. And as a stopgap measure, he took a job as a cutter in a coat factory. And it was supposed to be maybe a year or so. He became very active in Liberal Party politics, which is a New York State party. It's somewhat to the left of the Democrats. They held the balance of power, and they often ran candidates, and though the Democrats had to give them political appointments, and they promised, if you're active in this party, you'll be a judge in a year. Well, you'll be a judge next year. Well, actually, you'll be a judge. Wait for the next election. Well, once things have settled, it was 13 years. So that was the big regret of his life, those 13 years as a cutter. And then he did get the political appointment. But I always felt guilty about that, even though I was the result of the pregnancy, not the cause. Somehow I felt. But I do have to say, again, thank you to you, Joan. You're the one who, because you've been reading that book by David von Drehle about the Triangle Coat Waste fire. It was started by a cutter smoking, and von Drehle says in the book, nobody would tell the cutters not to smoke because they were the divas. Yeah, they were the divas of the factories, and they were such big shots that nobody would tell them what to do. And my father read something I wrote one time where I described his being a cutter, and he said, "You write about it as if it were a menial job. It was a skilled job, and I made $10,000 a week when it meant something." And that is interesting about immigrants and about the working class and about unions. It was because of the union that they had a decent salary. His time in the factory before that, he was not, he was when he was a kid, they were not unionized. So if the cutters were unionized, they only worked certain hours and their salary was decent, but the others could be told to work whenever they wanted, stay late, come in on Saturday. Nobody
I live in a building on the Lower East Side that was first financed by the garment workers, ladies garment workers team. So they were a powerful union.
Yes, yes, yes. And the fact that he, as in both an immigrant but also as a worker, he was able to buy a house. We, grew up in a house in Brooklyn, and was able to support his family well. And now they don't have those factory jobs. They don't exist. Unions are no longer powerful enough, and so now that's why the entire family has to work, and many of them 2 jobs each to support the family.
My last question to you, so we leave time for other people to ask questions, is about his politics. Very timely, right? He was a leftist. He was a communist who left the Communist Party when Stalin made the pact with Hitler. Lots of people left then, in 1939. And then many decades later, he was active in the Liberal Party. How did his political views affect his life? What do you think he would say about now? Anything you want to talk about his political self?
Yeah, I do have to say, and I hear other people saying this too about people they loved. I am so glad he didn't have to live to see this. His communism is very interesting, also related to his atheism, because he was raised in this Hasidic environment. I asked him at one point, he was a devout atheist. It was, no casual agnosticism. I had in separate interviews, conversations, I asked him, when did you become an atheist and when did you become a communist? And he answered them both the same way. When I was 6. I was influenced, he said, by my Aunt Magda. So again, I told you he grew up in the household of his mother, who was the oldest of many, many brothers and sisters, 13 of them that I can tell you their life stories, and some I do in the book. But the youngest was only 6 years older than my father, so she was more like an older sister. This was the Bolshevik Revolution. It was right after World War I. She was a teenager, and communism was the hope for a better future. Just as young people in so many other eras, they look around, they see injustice, they see inequality, they see terrible things, and this at the time was the hope. There won't be any anti-Semitism, there won't be any exploitation, these people working so hard and still being so poor. And so apparently, because they had this big house with all these brothers and sisters, on Friday night, the grandmother and grandfather would go to bed early, and this aunt would have all her friends in, and they'd have their meetings there. And my father was 6 years old, hanging around her, adored her, and he imbibed it. And he said that was where, that was how because the atheism and the communism went together for the communists. They believed that religion was what was keeping people from uniting together. So he was apparently quite active when he came to this country. He said he was an atheist, a Zionist, and a communist. And he said there was those things, you could be a socialist and a Zionist, communist and a Zionist. And somehow he found time to organize, to teach classes. He said one time they sent him to Coney Island to engage people in conversation and convince them to be more for the good of all, which was communism. I'll just say a couple words about his FBI file because it's interesting. A friend of mine told me that she had gotten her father's FBI file. He had died, and she discovered that he had this lifelong, very long affair with someone that the FBI had discovered. And so I told my father this, and I said, let's get your file. He was alive. And he said, well, you're not going to find anything interesting in it, and certainly no affair. But he agreed. It was kind of the same humorous, calm amusement as my interest in those letters. So, yeah, he got the file. It turns out that someone at Danbury had denounced him. And this was so revealing to me because he talked about his life in Danbury as so positive. They had all these close friends, these other Jews. It didn't cross my mind that they were the minority. There were only a few Jews there. that became friends. Oh, which reminds me, sorry, I should have told you when I told you the other story. When he left and gave up that job as parole officer, one of those friends got his job as parole officer, and a year later became warden, and he was Jewish. So,
So
yeah,
the guy was telling the truth, actually.
the warden was right that being Jewish would, yeah, and so that made those 13 years as a cutter all the more painful because he realized he had given up an opportunity to have a life that would have been, interesting, not like, and I had no idea when I was growing up that my father had such negative feelings about working in the factory. I didn't pick that up, but when I was one of the many, many, many things I learned about him so much later, interviewing him, when I said, how did you feel about the work as a cutter? And he said, I hated every minute of it. But he kept that a secret. He kept that a secret from us. But anyway, so sorry, I'm talking in circles, but just real briefly about that, that he was denounced by someone at Danbury, another guard. And he was apparently interrogated by the FBI twice. And they have I'm saying interrogated, they interviewed him. They called him in and questioned him, and they have transcripts of that. Most of the file was all blacked out, but they did have the transcripts of the interviews. And he says there, I don't know why anyone would think I'm a communist, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism among the guards, and there was a lot of resentment that he was promoted. And so he said maybe that's why somebody did that. And so it was just a view that I really had no idea of, that this work situation, which I thought of as so positive, was an environment where there was a lot of anti-Semitism. That was like a basic assumption in his life. That
Yes, they took all that for granted.
Yeah.
I have to draw us to a close because we have to leave room for people to ask questions. So Sam, give us the questions.
Indeed. And if you have a question tonight, again, you can drop it into the box down there at the bottom, the Q&A button, where some of you have already been putting some great questions that we've been enjoying looking at. I'm going to start out with one. This is from Marla Isaacs, who signs this, East 9th Street, Brooklyn. And Marla asks, what is the most exciting or most surprising insight about your father that you came upon after writing about him?
the most surprising was that maybe he didn't really have to quit high school at 14 and go to work in a factory. That was the one thing that made me reevaluate his entire life. And I really had to ask myself why he thought he had to if his mother didn't think he had to. Part of the reason that something that fed into that, I found he had talked about having taken a test after he'd only been in this country 2 years. He's about 14, still in high school before he dropped out. He went to Columbia, he took some test. He never told me why he took the test, but I found the record of it because he kept everything. And sure enough, it says that his verbal skills were equal to a college student. And they also do say that his social skills were not, he needed a lot of, he could develop his social skills and he should join clubs and things. But they offered him a scholarship on the basis of that. So I'm thinking at that point he was working in a shoe store many hours, making some money, already contributing to the family that way. If he had had the scholarship and kept working in the shoe store and maybe did some other things, maybe he didn't have to quit high school. And the conclusion I drew is this: when he described all his jobs, the very first one, he had first come to this country, didn't speak English, he was delivering telegrams. And he describes a scene, because of all the jobs, he describes scenes that on Christmas, two people gave him $1 tip, and many people gave him dimes and quarters, whereas normally it was negligible. And he counted out the tips, and his mother was so relieved that she cried. In all the stories my father told of his entire life, that is the only one in which his mother approves of him. And so that's my psychological interpretation, that he was looking for his mother's approval, and that's why he felt he had to do that, and to prove that he wasn't like his father, who she was always saying, "You're just like your father, no good, lazy."
You know, a great segue from that question. Somebody else asked if he had attended a religious school or a secular school before he left when he was 14. Did he had a secular education, or was he coming into the world without that?
Great question. In Warsaw, from the age of 4, he went to the religious school that was called Cheder. It was taught by a rabbi, and it was only studying Hebrew, studying to read Hebrew texts, and then as he got older, studying Talmud. And he did it all day from the age of 4 and hated it. Home at night and got tutoring in secular subjects. So a comment he once made was his entire life was childhood was lost to education. The year before they left Poland, they made the switch. He was sent to a secular gymnasium, I guess kind of like equivalent of high school, and he was studying Jewish subjects at night. But that was the one time in his life that he was not doing well in school, because he said those tutors had not really prepared him, and he was lost. And so when his mother asked him at the age of 11, shall we go to America, he was very much in favor because he felt he was failing in school. But then when he came to this country, again, it was both. He was sent to religious school at night and high school during the day until he quit at 14. Then he was self-educated.
One of the really cool things about this event, as we've mentioned a couple times, is that Joan, you and Deborah have known each other for such a long time. And somebody, Esther, asks if, Joan, if you have memories of Eli, and if you'd be able to talk a little bit about that.
I don't remember him distinctly, but I remember her mother better because she was around more. But I do remember him being there. I remember how much Deborah liked him. Not everybody was getting along with your parents in those days. And when I saw his picture again on the book, I remembered him. You know, I thought, oh yeah, he looked like that. That's right. You know.
But remember, that was the theme, that my father was never there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I remember him as a benign presence when he was there, but I don't remember him very distinctly.
So Nell asks, Deborah, if your sisters wrote the book, how would it be different?
I love that question, and so my sisters are here, so if they want to add something, please do. And they've been very generous about my writing about them. And by the way, my sisters appear in many of my books, including especially the one about sisters, but the one about about mothers and daughters as well. My oldest sister, Naomi, tended, like me, to idealize our father and be critical of our mother. Mimi has really, I say she keeps me on the straight and narrow, and has been such an important corrective to me. She will point out to me in many instances that I'm being too easy on, I'm letting my father off the hook and being way too critical of my mother. So I think they have slightly different takes on that. But again, Naomi is 8 years older, so her experience of our father is quite different because he was home all the time. Not all, like a typical parent. He worked during the day, he spent evenings with her, he spent weekends with her. But Mimi's experience was like mine. I mean, by the time we were old enough, came back to, she was 2 when I was born. And so she also, he was gone all the time, and I think was kind of, that aspect was similar. But I think Mimi related better to my mother, and so having my father gone all the time wasn't quite as much of a hardship, maybe. I mean, I really felt that my father was the one who understood me. If I said something, he would know how I meant it. Yeah, and if Mimi and Naomi, if you want to comment, write it in the chat room.
We have a question from Susan, and she wants to know, did you ever look for Helen? Did you ever find out where she ended up?
You know, when my father told me about Helen, he always said how guilty he felt. He felt so guilty when I asked, you know, how did you feel when you decided to marry? Well, I was doing the right thing, but I had to betray the other one. And he said, I feel guilty about it to this day. So he wanted to know that Helen had married. That was his view of life. If a woman was married, her life was successful. If she wasn't married, her life was failure. That was it. My mother too, that was the view. And by the way, that created a lot of friction with me because I met my husband when I was 40, so my mother was quite beside herself until that. So I did try to find, I actually hired a private investigator to find out if she had married, but I was not able to find out while my father was alive.
Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you. This has been a really remarkable conversation. And what a remarkable life Eli Tannen had. My goodness, it was quite a ride. And it must have been so interesting to interview him in research for this book. Was that you're a researcher and have been throughout your life? Was that strange to do that kind of research with your father?
The fact that as a scholar, going through papers and organizing them, and that was quite natural to me, and I like that. But yeah, I mean, the fact that it was my father made it both more compelling, more fascinating, and sometimes upsetting. I mean, as I said, I idealized him. When I was reading his journals, I found things that I didn't find all that admirable. There's a lot about his sex life that I read about, and even that he told me about. And I was very torn about how much of that to put in, and some of it was quite relevant to this decision about who he's going to marry, so I definitely needed to include that. So it was complicated, but very very gratifying because I loved him so much. When I comment toward the end, maybe it's a good way to close this too. This is the end of the first chapter. So we're talking about, he's 97 at this point. We're talking about how long he lived and how long I might live and how I'm going to like living that long. And I said, well, I guess I won't know till it happens. And he says, well, I'll have to talk to you from up there. And then he said, I'll be watching you from upstairs. And I felt like by writing about him and having all these notes and reading things he had written to me and notes I took about conversations, which every time I talked to him on the phone, I'd be transcribing the conversation, a little crazy. And that really, I kept that conversation going, and he was still talking to me from up there. And it did feel like by keeping the book, writing it so long, I was keeping those conversations going. But I also feel that now by having the book and having finished it, that I get to keep him with me, and that's very gratifying.
I loved the ending, as I have told Deborah. I just wanted to
Thank you.
Well, we are grateful that you wrote this book, and if you need to know what Joan's talking about, read the ending. You can order a copy of Finding My Father. There's a link in the chat. Deborah Tannen, thank you so much. Joan Silber, thank you for joining us. This has been a lovely way to spend an hour. Thank you for starting my week off well. Again, Deborah Tannen, the new book is Finding My Father. Here it is. And you can also, there's a link in the chat to order novels by Joan Silber, including Improvement. This is the most recent, and we'll be looking out for in May of 2021, that new Joan Silber novel. So mark your calendars, everyone.
I want to just add that Improvement is amazing, and all Joan's books are completely amazing.
regularly on our staff favorites page when these come around. So thank you both for writing wonderful books and for joining us this evening. And to everyone else out there from wherever you're joining us, we hope we'll see you again. Thank you for spending an hour with us, and we really appreciate your continued support. Wherever you are tonight, be safe, be well, do good work, read good books, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Joan. Good night.
Oh, bye.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Deb.